I am in London, England at Trafalgar Square. And this magnificent building on the square is the National Gallery. It is one of the world's great art museums, housing a very impressive collection of artwork, and best of all, there's free entry. The National Gallery was built in 1838, designed by William Wilkins, and it was actually under a lot of scrutiny back in the day, as the building was quite narrow, though it has been expanded now, and the interior was redone. But still, there isn't all that much exhibition space compared to the other giant art museums of the era. There's a statue of George Washington, the American general who beat the British Army. And here's a statue of James II as a Roman emperor. Now I only have 1 hour to go through this museum, so I'm going to be moving very quickly. Also, even though I think they allow filming, I wasn't sure, and due to my time constraints I just took pictures, so this will be a photo tour. This museum used to not allow photography, but they changed that a few years back, so I want to commend them for that. The gallery starts with 12th century art and ends around the year 1900, so there's not really any ancient art or 20th century art here. There's other museums here in London for that. This is a Florentine painting of the Battle of San Romano. This is the Annunciation with Saint Emitius by Carlo Crivelli from the late 13th century. Here's a Crivelli altarpiece. This is a painting by Giovanni Bellini, depicting the assassination of St. Peter. Here's the Agony in the Garden by Bellini. These are some portraits by the great Titian. This Titian painting shows Christ appearing to Mary Magdalene. Here's the Holy Family with a Shepherd by Titian. This museum has a fantastic Italian art collection. There are several rooms full of great pieces. This is perhaps the most famous piece at the National Gallery, The Virgin of the Rocks by none other than Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci painted this in the 1490s, then continued working on it from 1506 to 1508. The Virgin Mary is depicted on some rocks, hence the name. She is positioned between baby Jesus Christ on the right, who's being held up by an angel, and baby St. John the Baptist on the left. Leonardo presented a very unique and original interpretation of the Immaculate Conception with this painting. The rocky cavern-like landscape around them is fantastic. This was the second version of the rocks by Leonardo da Vinci, not the original. That one is at the Louvre. This one is more heavily restored than the original, so they do look a bit different in their coloration. Wow, this is amazing to see. Here's a charcoal drawing by Leonardo da Vinci called the Burlington House cartoon. It depicts the Virgin and Child with St. Anne and St. John the Baptist, so it's a similar scene to the Virgin of the Rocks. He sketched this in 1499. This is another one of the most famous paintings in the gallery, the Arnolfini portrait by Jan van Eyck, painted in 1434. This portrait shows a wealthy Italian merchant and his wife while living in Bruges, Belgium. They clearly live in a pretty fancy house. Also, fun fact, the artist added his signature on the wall above that mirror. It says Jan van Eyck was here. Here's another Jan van Eyck portrait. These panels depict Saints John the Baptist and Lawrence, once part of an altarpiece in Florence. But it turns out there are some painted cranes on the backside. This room features some paintings from Western Germany. There was lots of great religious artwork being created over there for their magnificent cathedrals. This is the circumcision. That's graphic. Here's the Adoration of the Shepherds by Luca Signorelli. This is an unfinished painting by Michelangelo, who didn't really like painting. It is called the Manchester Madonna, painted in 1497. They have not one but two Michelangelo paintings here. This one is titled The Entombment, showing Christ being carried to his tomb. He painted this in 1500 and also left it unfinished. That's a Florentine altarpiece. This is the San Domenico Predella, panels from a high altarpiece by Fra Angelico. Angelico was one of the most important early Renaissance painters. He made this in the 1420s, probably after he took a novitiate when he stopped painting for a year, to instead receive religious instruction, so this apparently reflects his theological training. This central panel shows Christ glorified in heaven surrounded by the saints. And that's Fra Angelico's portrait of Saint Romulus. This is the Wilton diptych, most likely English from 1400, and it has a goat on it. Now entering the original rooms of the National Gallery. These expansive chambers are richly decorated with great wallpaper, some have intricate ceilings, and it's just like an old school art gallery. Here's yet another Titian. This was the largest group portrait he ever made. And this is the Raising of Lazarus by Sebastiano del Piombo, who was a friend of Michelangelo and incorporated some of his designs in this. This room is mostly filled with Peter Paul Rubens' works. This one's titled Minerva Protects Pax from Mars. This is the Rape of the Sabine Woman, showing the Roman king Romulus watching his soldiers carry off women. That's nice. The naked guy is Drunken Silenus, supported by satyrs. This was possibly by Anthony van Dyck. This is the Four Elements of Earth, a giant painting with vegetables, fish, poultry, and game. Back to Rubens. This is his interpretation of Samson and Delilah from 1609. And this is the Apotheosis of the Duke of Buckingham by Rubens. This is the Rembrandt room. I definitely think that Rembrandt was one of the greatest artists. I always love seeing his work in person. This is the Adoration of the Shepherds, technically made by a pupil of Rembrandt. This is a classic self-portrait of Rembrandt, as he appeared at the age of 34 in 1640. At that age he was quite successful already. He is looking rather smug here. There's a portrait of an old man in an armchair from the 1650s. This is an elderly man depicted as St. Paul from the late 1650s. He did a lot of religious figure portraits during that time. Here are some more portraits by Rembrandt. And here is yet another Rembrandt self-portrait, one of his last. He's a bit older in this one at the age of 63. He painted this in 1669, just months before his death in October of that year. He is looking rather frail here in the final year of his life, but he was still masterfully painting. In his 63 years, he painted over 80 self-portraits. This is a very large portrait of Frederick Rihel on horseback from about 1663. This is the only equestrian painting Rembrandt ever did. The subject was a wealthy Amsterdam businessman who was a very avid horseman. These are 4 officers of the Amsterdam Coopers and Wijnrakers Guild, not by Rembrandt. Here's some more quintessential Dutch portraiture. This is Christ Before the High Priest by the Dutch artist Gerard van Honthorst. This is a unique painting by Rembrandt, titled Belshazzar's Feast from 1636. It depicts the Babylonian king Belshazzar at a lavish feast, serving wine that one of his predecessors had looted from the temple at Jerusalem, but suddenly he saw a handwrite in Hebrew that God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances, and art found wanting. Belshazzar was killed later that night. This is a portrait of a young man holding a skull by Frans Hals. This is a portrait of Cardinal Richelieu, who served as Louis XIII's chief minister. This room has lots of Spanish and Italian pieces. This is a portrait of Philip IV of Spain by Diego Velazquez, one of the most important Spanish artists. They have a lot of Diego Velazquez works. I definitely haven't seen so many in one place. This is Velazquez's Immaculate Conception. Here's Christ after the flagellation, contemplated by the Christian soul, painted by Velazquez in 1628. This is another Velazquez, depicting Philip IV hunting wild boar. This is Perseus turning Phineas and his followers to stone by Luca Giordano. This great hall contains a bunch of British artwork, with the works of Reynolds, Gainsborough, and more. This is neat. Here's a classic painting by J.M.W. Turner. It shows Ulysses deriding Polyphemus from that scene in the Odyssey. That's fantastic. This is also one of his most famous works, titled Dutch Boats in a Gale. He painted this in 1801. Here some Dutch boats are about to collide during a storm on the sea. Here's another Turner that depicts a train instead of a boat. They came about during his lifetime. He made this in 1844. This is definitely the most noticeable painting in the room. It's a giant horse. The horse's name is Whistlejacket. He was a prized racehorse in the 18th century, and this was made by a specialist horse painter named George Stubbs. This is The Watering Place by Thomas Gainsborough. Here's a painting of Venice, depicting the basin of San Marco on Ascension Day in 1740. And here's another classical scene of Venice. The architecture in this central room is incredible. Here's a painting of the execution of Lady Jane Grey. The Lady Jane Grey was Queen of Britain for 9 days in 1553 until she was deposed by Mary, who sentenced her to be beheaded at the Tower of London. That's a portrait of Napoleon from 1815, the year of his final defeat at Waterloo. Here's a Eugene Delacroix painting of the banished poet Ovid among the Scythians. Here are some young Spartans exercising, painted by Edgar Degas fairly early in his career. This is the corner of a cafe by Edouard Manet. Alright, now we are getting into the Impressionists. They have some real gems at the National Gallery. This is a Renoir titled The Skiff, or L'Aïeul. Here's a piece by George Bellows called Men of the Docks, set in Lower Manhattan. Bellows was an American Impressionist, and this was bought by the National Gallery in 2014 as the first major American painting here. Here's an Henri Rousseau. I love his stuff. This one is titled Surprised. In this, a tiger is surprised by a man's arrival in the jungle. This is The Umbrellas by Pierre-Auguste Renoir. A Hillside in Provence by Paul Cézanne, one of his classic scenes set in Aix-en-Provence. Here's another Cézanne from the early 1900s, depicting the grounds of the Chateau Noir. This is the Museum at Le Havre by Claude Monet. Le Havre was his hometown, and this painting shows the Musée des Beaux-Arts in that town. This is a great one, called Bathers at La Grenier by Monet. Renoir and Monet spent the summer of 1869 working at this cafe and bathing spot on the Seine. Here are some genuine Claude Monet water lilies. He made this one after 1916 when he had a big new studio built at Giverny. This was part of his big water lily project, which served as a personal tribute to all the French men and civilians who died during the Great War. The full ginormous water lilies that Monet gifted to the nation is now at the Orangerie in Paris. This one didn't end up as part of it. And there's Claude Monet's autograph. Here's another water lilies painting from about 1907. The lighting is set during sunset. Here are some irises, inspired by those in his water lily pond. This is a snow scene at Argenteuil by Claude Monet, painted in 1875. This is a portrait of Hermine Gallia by Gustave Klimt. I don't think I'd ever seen a real Klimt before. The famed Viennese artist painted this in 1904. This is one of the most famous works of Georges Seurat, titled The Bathers at Asnières from 1884. Seurat was a pointillist, so this is entirely composed of little points. Pretty incredible. These bathers are hanging out at Asnières, a suburb of Paris. That island on the right side of the painting across the Seine is the Isle de la Grande Jatte, which is the setting for Seurat's most famous painting. These are some studies made by Georges Seurat. He would often make lots of preparatory works for his large paintings. Here's another Georges Seurat, The Channel of Grave Lines at Grand Fort Philippe from 1890. Here are some portraits by Camille Pissarro. This is a late afternoon in Camille Pissarro's garden. Here's a rather early Pablo Picasso from 1901. It's called Motherhood, and it is very similar to the traditional Madonna and Child style. This is La Coiffure, or Combing the Hair by Edgar Degas, and this picture was owned by the artist Henri Matisse. Speaking of Henri Matisse, this is his handiwork, a portrait of Greta Mole from 1908. This is a wall of Van Goghs. The National Gallery has a very impressive assemblage of his works. This is Van Gogh's chair. He painted this in 1888. It is a very iconic piece. Just a simple yellow chair with his tobacco pipe on the seat. He painted this while in Arles, not long after Paul Gauguin joined him. Things didn't go too well from there. That's a Van Gogh right next to a Matisse. This place is fantastic. Here's a lesser known work of Vincent Van Gogh, titled Long Grass with Butterflies. This was painted in the gardens of the asylum at Saint Remy near Arles in 1890. He wrote that the grass grew tall and unkept there. These are the Sunflowers by Vincent Van Gogh, one of his most famous paintings. Van Gogh really liked sunflowers and the color yellow. He made 4 of these sunflower paintings. I have seen the one at Philadelphia before, but he hung this particular painting in the guest bedroom at the Arles house. These are 2 crabs as painted by Vincent Van Gogh. Just after his release from the hospital in Arles in early 1890, he made a bunch of still lifes, including some depicting crabs like this one. And here's yet another one of Van Gogh's most iconic paintings, titled A Wheat Field with Cypresses. There were cypresses in a wheat field near the Saint Remy mental asylum, which Van Gogh likened to Egyptian obelisks. Here's a group of Paul Gauguin paintings, including a still life with fruit and one of his works from Tahiti. This is a Paul Gauguin painting of a vase with flowers. He made it in 1896. This is a Claude Monet painting that he made while here in London. It depicts the Thames below Westminster in 1871. He stayed here during that year to avoid the Franco-Prussian War. That's an Alfred Sisley painting of the watering place of Marly-le-Roi, the remains of a ruined chateau Sisley often painted. Here's Sisley's depiction of the Thames at Charing Cross Bridge in 1874. This is a definitive early work of Claude Monet, picturing the Gare Saint-Lazare in 1877. He made 12 versions of this painting. These are Floodwaters by Monet. Here's a Manet portrait of a woman, actually his wife, with a cat from 1880. This is a painting by Edouard Manet showing the execution of the Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian. He was the puppet emperor of Mexico installed by Napoleon III, but here he is being executed by Mexican Republicans in 1867. This painting was cut up after Manet's death, but Edgar Degas actually reassembled the fragments. This is A Summer's Day by Bertha Morisot. Here's another portrait by Morisot, a very underrated impressionist. This is the acrobat Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando by Edgar Degas. Here's a self-portrait of Paul Cézanne that he did in 1880. Yet another Cézanne depiction of Provence. This is a landscape with poplars. This is the Sea à l'Estaque by Paul Cézanne, portraying a fishing village near Marseille. There's even more Pissarros over here. And this is an old woman with a rosary, painted by Paul Cézanne in 1895. Here's a side-by-side comparison of 2 paintings. One was made by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres in the mid-19th century, and next to it is a copy of that painting made by Pablo Picasso in his own unique way. So this is Madame Moitié by Ingres in 1856. It was a commissioned portrait of the 23-year-old newlywed. Next to her is a woman with a book by Pablo Picasso that he did in 1932. a painting of his own muse, Marie-Therese Walter, done in Picasso's own very creative and colorful manner in 1932. The Woman with a Book is a reenactment of Ingres's portrait, done about 75 years after the original. Art really changed over that time. Well, the National Gallery is most impressive. Also, there is a special Raphael exhibition going on right now. I didn't know about this and it cost extra, but I really wish I could have seen that. That was amazing. Now let's take a look around Trafalgar Square. That is St. Martin in the Fields, a neoclassical masterpiece built in the 1720s. There is currently a big glob of ice cream on the square, definitely a bit odd. The sculpture is called The End. It has an enormous fly on it. That drone is actually transmitting a live stream of the square. Here's a statue of General Charles James Napier from the War of 1812. The centerpiece of Trafalgar Square is Nelson's Column, a gigantic 169-foot tall column topped by a statue of Admiral Horatio Nelson. Nelson led the victorious British Royal Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 against both the French and Spanish navies. That battle wiped both of their countries' naval capacities and allowed for global British supremacy of the seas for a century. However, Admiral Nelson didn't live to see it through, as he was shot and killed during the battle. The column was erected in 1843. There are massive bronze lions at the base of the column. That is the Admiralty Arch, the gateway to the Mall and Buckingham Palace. Also, here's an equestrian statue of Charles I. So that was the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square, 2 must-sees while in London. If you enjoyed this video, then please give it a like, also share it and subscribe to my channel. I have lots of other video tours of art museums, along with other types of museums, historic sites and more, including some other videos on London attractions, so make sure to take a look at those. Thanks for watching!